Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk and Q&A. Tonight with us we've got Alex Nunns, the author of The Candidate, a book that charts the rise of Jeremy Corbyn from the backbenches of Labour scrabbling to get enough nominations to even get on the ballot for leader of the Labour Party to the position where he was at the last general election, taking one of the biggest vote shares that Labour's had for a very long time. I don't know how many people here have already...
It's going in and out.
It's going in and out? Okay.
Speak right into the middle.
I will. It's a great book. I've read it myself, and I think one of the things that I most enjoyed about it was the fast pace and the way that it really recreates the feeling or the exciting times that were happening around when Jeremy Corbyn was getting elected, the Brexit vote and other things like that. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that from Alex. But yeah, I'll hand over now to Alex.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that okay? You can hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for squeezing into this tight space. Let me take you back to a few seconds before 10 p.m. on the 8th of June last year, on the general election night. You might have been watching BBC One. I was watching it. I'd just been canvassing for Labour in Battersea, and I was in my car watching on my phone. Jeremy Corbyn was at his house in Islington with his wife, Laura Alvarez, and his chief of staff, Carrie Murphy, who's a kind of redhead, strong-willed Glaswegian, and his chief of strategy, Seamus Milne, who is currently very famous as of yesterday. I interviewed Carrie Murphy for the book, for The Candidate, and she described the scene to me. She said that the main thing she remembered was that Jeremy Corbyn's got a tiny television. She said, none of your big fancy screens on the wall, forget all that, a tiny TV on a pile of books, which must be the most Jeremy Corbyn thing you've ever heard. She said that her and Seamus and Jeremy were standing right in front of the TV because it was so small and they couldn't see the graphics, and they were all kind of on the edge of their, well, not on the edge of their seats, and out of their seats, waiting to hear the result of the exit poll. None of them had any idea what was coming. They didn't get any kind of pre-briefing from the BBC or anything like that, but Jeremy Corbyn made them all write down their predictions, and Carrie Murphy, Chief of Staff, wrote down 39%. But she'd been saying for weeks that they were going to win the election. She was resolutely optimistic. The others were a bit more pessimistic, tempered by the internal polling of the Labour Party, which had suggested they were going to get 33%, and tempered by experience as well. On TV, David Dimbleby was wittering on over some kind of hyperactive background music. He said there are just 20 seconds to go until Big Ben strikes 10 p.m. By the magic of psephology, we're able to predict what we think has happened tonight. He stopped talking. He turned and he faced a giant kind of Big Ben on a screen. The hyperactive background music faded out, and there was about a second where everything stopped and there was just silence. And in that 1 second pause, fate hung in the balance for the Labour Party, for Jeremy Corbyn as leader, and for the movement which had cohered around him in 2015 and carried him into the election. Most people thought that the risk that the Labour Party had taken when it elected Corbyn twice was about to be shown to be a catastrophic mistake, that all the effort that everybody had poured in for 2 years could have all come to nothing. And then Big Ben bonged, the clock face on the screen dissolved into a picture of Theresa May's face. David Dimbleby said, the Conservatives are the largest party, but they don't have an overall majority at this stage. And at that point, politics really kind of turned on its head in this country. In Corbyn's house, there were gasps. Seamus Milne exclaimed, hung Parliament. The others said things like, oh my God, and other things which are slightly less polite. And then we moved on to where we are today. But the result itself was extraordinary. Labour didn't win the 2017 general election, obviously, but it did record its biggest increase in vote share since 1945, 9.5 points, which was even more remarkable because the previous election had only been 2 years before. Jeremy Corbyn became the only Labour leader other than Tony Blair to break the 40% barrier since 1970. 12.9 million people voted for the Labour Party. Apart from in 1997 in the landslide, Labour hadn't won so many votes since 1966. And in England, it was the second highest number of votes that Labour had won ever. And that all happened really in the space of the 7-week election campaign last year, because going into that campaign, as everybody probably remembers, Labour was doing abysmally in the polls. It was on 25% in quite a few polls. During the course of the 7-week campaign, they made up between 11 and 16 points, depending which poll you look at. Political commentators were dumbfounded. This had never happened before. Almost universally, they had predicted disaster. Dan Hodges, one of the great thinkers of our time, he tweeted early in the election, Labour's, this is a quote, "Labour's vote is completely imploding and a significant proportion of it is switching directly to the Conservatives." And he said that Labour was going to get 20%. Nick Cohen, the Observer columnist, wrote a controversial column last week in which he just displayed some sexism. He said, "Can Labour MPs declare independence from Corbyn and run as a separate party, or do they in this country have to go down with the fall?" When Corbyn gave a press conference at the start of the election campaign, an ITV reporter asked, "You say you speak for the many, not the few, but only a very few people believe you." So this was the kind of general consensus in the media. On election day itself, the predictions came out from all the experts on politics that tell the rest of the public how politics works. John Rentoul said that the Tories were going to get a majority of 78. Piers Morgan went for between 90 and 100. Dan Hodges, who's never to be outdone when it comes to getting something wrong, said 110 Tory majority. And as we now know, the Tory majority was wiped out altogether. So how was it done? Well, I argue in the book that the election result was really an expression of the same phenomenon that had brought Jeremy Corbyn about in the first place. One reason why I think so many of those commentators got it so completely wrong was that they'd gone out of their way to not understand what had happened in the Labour Party over the previous 2 years. They had a habit of viewing Labour as if it was a controlled experiment, something being done in a science lab. So you could, this strange result had happened in 2015, and you could observe these bizarre phenomena, but you didn't really have to understand them because Labour was going to be crushed in an election anyway. But it should have been obvious, really, when you're talking about a party that grew to 500,000 members, that the Labour Party was part of society, and that if a significant proportion of those people in the Labour Party thought that the best response to the political world they were living in was to elect Jeremy Corbyn leader, it was always possible that a big proportion of the public could come to the same conclusion, but that possibility was completely ruled out. I think that that's exactly what happened in the general election, that there was a kind of anti-establishment sentiment, which is the same sentiment which had been picked up on in the Labour Party, which was actually much wider than the party itself. And 71% of the voters that Labour gained in 2017 believed that the establishment had let them down, and that's a much higher proportion than was found in the general public as a whole. Labour's 2017 election performance was all the more extraordinary, really, because it came against the background of a civil war that was carrying on within the party, even during the election itself. Labour effectively ran 2 election campaigns in parallel, and I don't think this has really ever happened before. It's quite a unique historical opportunity to kind of compare them, because the leader's office, Jeremy Corbyn and Jeremy Corbyn's staff, they were convinced that they could draw on the lessons of their 2015 and 2016 leadership elections, and they could kind of appeal to this anti-establishment sentiment over the heads of the media, try and get the message out through social media and through the movement, and try and create that kind of snowball effect which we saw in 2015 and 2016. Labour HQ, the party bureaucracy, the party staff, they had a different idea. Basically, because they had a different objective. Corbyn had to succeed in order to stay leader and to keep his project alive. The Labour Party bureaucracy generally wanted to survive the weathering, just to survive the election, to come out of the other side of it intact, even if a bit battered. So they said, they ran a very traditional Labour campaign, but very defensive one. They said that you can't really move the opinion polls by more than 2 to 3 points in a campaign. That's what history shows. You can't really engage non-voters. They're non-voters because they don't vote, and there's no point really appealing to young people. One official said at one point, why are we bothering to register students, because their term's going to break up, they're not going to be at university when the election comes. This came to a kind of clash on the 4th of May, a few weeks into the election, when they all had a meeting, and the party staff were kind of churlish and saying we don't understand what the strategy is. And Carrie Murphy, Jeremy Corbyn's chief of staff, blasted them and kind of shouted, "You fucking do understand the strategy. You don't like the strategy. You don't want the strategy, but you do know the strategy." But this battle just continued to rage, really, throughout the election campaign. and you can see it in where resources were allocated by the Labour Party machinery. So I obtained a list showing what the Labour Party was doing about to respond to the collapse of UKIP, because UKIP started to collapse during the election campaign, and the Labour Party was very worried that lots of these votes were going to go to the Conservatives. So it drew up a list of where it had to send extra resources for social media help and for mailings and so on and so forth. And if you just look down the list, the first person, it goes from the safest seat to the least safe seat. The first person to receive extra funding was Angela Eagle, who obviously started a challenge against Jeremy Corbyn in 2016, which didn't go very far. She was replaced by Owen Smith. But she got extra resources even though she had a majority of 16,000 and not a particularly big UKIP vote in the constituency. And then you go down the list and the names are very familiar. You get Dan Jarvis, another kind of leadership contender, Yvette Cooper, Tom Watson, all the names you'd expect. And these seats were all marked as looking marginal, even though they all had quite healthy majorities. But I think the election result itself decided that argument. It showed it was possible to win over non-voters. According to a big poll by the TUC, 38% of the voters that Labour gained in 2017, which is 2 million people, had not voted in 2015. And 1.5 million of those had been non-voters in 2015. The other 500,000 were newly eligible, so mainly young people. It was possible to engage young voters. Labour won 60% of the under 30 vote, which is quite staggering because in 2015 they won 36%, which was already ahead of the Tories, but a swing from 36 to 60% among under 30s is something quite extraordinary. It was possible for a mass membership party to have an electoral impact. All those members were useful in going out and canvassing. Lots of that was down to Labour's own ground game and the self-motivation of Labour members to go and knock on people's doors and try to persuade them. But also, because the Labour Party officially was running quite a defensive campaign, it was often left to Momentum to go and campaign in marginal seats. Momentum held training days in marginal seats and tried to direct activists to those seats. And in lots of them, the Labour Party wasn't really running much of an official campaign. For example, Sheffield Hallam, Nick Clegg's seat, Labour wasn't doing much. It was mainly Momentum campaign there, which Labour won. Most of all, I think, the 2017 election result showed that it was possible to win mass support for a left-wing platform. And I think that's the greatest achievement because Labour actually added 5 million voters who hadn't voted for the party in 2015 in 2017. Its overall vote went up by 3.6 million, I think, but it lost some of the 2015 voters drifted away. So in total, 5 million new voters opted for Labour in 2017. And I think that broke the spell of 1983, the idea that had become dogma, really, that under Michael Foot, Labour had gone to the country with a left-wing manifesto and had been crushed. And that spell was really broken by Jeremy Corbyn not repeating that fate as so many people expected him to. And I think the legacy of that is that it boxed out some space for progressive politics in this country, which just wasn't there before. And I don't think it matters whether you're on the left or the right of the Labour Party or just a generally kind of progressive person who wants the world to be better. That space for progressive ideas and for discussion just had evaporated really in the time before the 2015 general election, and Ed Miliband tried to revive it, but he failed, obviously. I think it's fair to say that achievement should be credited to a large degree to the movement which came together to get Corbyn as leader in 2015 inside the Labour Party. That's really what kind of changed the rules of the game. But that movement could never have come about without Labour changing the rules by which it elects its leader in 2014 in a big set of reforms. And I won't go into them in detail because they're probably quite boring, but it was one of those great historical ironies where it was really the right of the Labour Party that was pushing for the rules to be changed, and the left was fiercely opposing these rule changes, most of the left, except for Len McCluskey and Unite. And without these rule changes, there's no way Jeremy Corbyn could ever have been elected leader. At the time, I quote some of the people who commented on it at the time. Really, what was significant about these rule changes was, well, there were a few things, but one of them was the registered supporter scheme, which allowed people to join the Labour Party for £3 or register as a supporter of the Labour Party for £3 and get a vote in the contest. But that got a lot of attention. But much more important than that was that the old system, which was an electoral college which had a third of the vote reserved for MPs, a third for trade union members and a third for party members, that third reserved for MPs was effectively a veto on an outsider candidate. Because if if someone like Diane Abbott stands, as she did in 2010, she got very little support from MPs, and that effectively meant she had no hope of winning. So therefore, people had to vote for Ed Miliband if they didn't want David Miliband. So that rule change was crucial. But at the time, people were saying things like this. Tony Blair himself, he said, Ed Miliband has shown real courage and leadership on this issue. It's a long overdue reform that I should have done myself. It puts individual people in touch with the party, and it's a great way of showing how Labour can reconnect with the people of Britain. Tristram Hunt, one-time Blairite MP until he got bored and resigned his seat, he said on the 8th of May 2015, one of Ed Miliband's great legacies as leader of the party was the reforms to party organisation, which mean that actually lots of people can be involved in picking the new leader. To be fair to Tristram Hunt, that was true. It's just it didn't quite work out as he expected. And then here's the best one, John Rentoul, the columnist for The Independent. He said, Miliband's reform is the real thing, and it will have real and welcome consequences, whatever the result of the next general election. If Ed Miliband loses, it means the next Labour leader will be a Blairite. So, he's a professional. He gets paid for that kind of insight. So that rule change really opened the way for a left candidate to stand, even though they didn't know it yet. But there was still a problem in 2015 after the general election defeat, after Miliband lost, in that the left didn't have a candidate or a volunteer to stand for leader. And really Jeremy Corbyn was about the last people anyone thought of. Initially, there was quite a strong sentiment that it would be a mistake to stand a candidate at all. That's what John McDonnell thought, because the left was likely to get beaten. And it wouldn't, it could be, Owen Jones as well said it would be the death rights for the left if they went down to a crushing defeat. But there was a kind of wisdom of crowds effect, whereby there was lots of pressure exerted by party members in the constituencies, and especially online, the first sign of what became familiar in the kind of online Corbyn movement, saying we need a candidate. But nobody wanted to do it. People were trying to pressure John McDonnell to stand. He didn't want to do it. He said he'd done it twice in 2007, 2010. Michael Meacher, but he was ill, unfortunately. John Trickett, he didn't want to do it. He didn't think he was the right person. Ian Lavery, who came out and backed Burnham. There were a bunch of new left-wing MPs who had been elected in 2015, but they were felt to be too inexperienced. But there were still some activists who were trying to persuade them to stand. So some activists were bugging Clive Lewis, for example, to stand. He replied to them, I don't even know where the toilets are in Parliament. I can't lead the Labour Party. For a while last year, it looked like he'd found the toilets, but now he seems to be holding it in. But in the end, there was a meeting between John Landsman, a kind of linchpin on the left, who was very actively trying to get a candidate to stand for leader, and a guy called Byron Taylor, who was the national officer for the trade union Labour Party liaison organisation, which brought together the affiliated unions. And Byron Taylor said, John Landsman said, we need a candidate, blah, blah, but we haven't got anybody. And Byron Taylor said, it's got to be Jeremy. He's the nicest man in politics and he hasn't got any enemies. But he seems to have gained some. But that insight proved correct and was crucial for Jeremy Corbyn getting on the ballot. I think it was his relentless politeness which encouraged some of his colleagues in the Labour Party to give him their nomination, because to stand for leader he had to have 35 signed nominations. And then John McDonnell himself says there's no way that they would have let John McDonnell anywhere near it. But with Jeremy Corbyn, one feature was that he was so nice to people that they were willing to give him a chance, even if they didn't support him. But still, getting on the ballot, that was really the crucial moment of agency in this whole process, where people's actions made a difference. There was an unprecedented lobbying operation, both in Parliament and outside it, but it still came down to the final seconds. On, I think it was the 15th of June, might have been 12th of June, 2015. By midday, any leadership candidate had to have 35 signed pieces of paper handed in to the office of the Parliamentary Labour Party in Westminster. With 5 minutes to go, they thought, the Corbyn campaign thought they were on 33. John McDonnell was running the operation. He had a clipboard with him and he was marking down the MPs who came in and nominated Jeremy Corbyn. And this was quite hair-raising, because lots of these MPs were coming back from their constituencies on trains. If their train had been delayed, they might have promised to nominate Corbyn, but they might not get there by midday, and so on. But anyway, he'd noted down 33 names on this clipboard. There were 5 MPs standing in this office who had promised that they would nominate Jeremy Corbyn for leader if they were the 35th nomination. If they were the last one, just to get him over the line, they would do it. For some reason, there was something terrible and dreadful about being the 34th nominator that none of them were willing to risk. So this was kind of a surreal situation, like something from a Lewis Carroll story or something, where there were enough people there, enough support, easy to get Jeremy Corbyn onto the ballot, but none of them would move unless somebody else moved. And this went on for a while. It got desperate. Jeremy Corbyn was stood outside the office, stopping passing Tory MPs, saying, "Do you want to join Labour for £3?" John Landsman was running around trying to get Tom Watson to help nominate Jeremy Corbyn, and Tom Watson had said, he kind of said he would nominate him if he absolutely had to, but he didn't want to. So he's got a reputation as a kind of fixer. So he was standing there texting MPs who were literally 2 metres away from him, saying, "You've got to nominate Jeremy Corbyn." The extraordinary thing about this whole scenario, which kind of dragged on until the final seconds, was that John McDonnell's clipboard was wrong. He'd missed one. They actually already had 34, so none of this had to happen at all. This is absolutely classic left-wing organisation. But in the final seconds, John McDonnell literally got down on his knees and pleaded, and he said to these MPs, "For the sake of democracy, nominate Jeremy." And John, being John, for anyone who knows him, he added a threat and said, "Members will never forgive you if you don't." And with 10 seconds to go, according to John McDonnell, 2 of them cracked. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn says it's 118 seconds, but John McDonnell's story's better, even though he's obviously exaggerating. He says 10 seconds to go. And then Big Ben bonged and Jeremy Corbyn was on the ballot. And we know the rest was really history. There were some big moments in that campaign, such as the welfare bill, when the Tories brought in draconian benefit cuts, and the 3 other candidates for the leadership of the Labour Party abstained, as they were told to by Harriet Harman, who was leader at the time. But Jeremy Corbyn became the only candidate not to abstain, which was a big moment. But in general, there was a constituency there for Jeremy Corbyn's message, which just needed someone to speak to it, really. It wasn't that Jeremy Corbyn conjured this movement from nowhere. There was a demand for that voice to be heard. And Jeremy Corbyn went on, obviously, to win a big victory. None of that would have made any difference. None of those incidents would have made any difference if the circumstances hadn't been right, I don't think. History is made up of moments of agency like those, but people make their own history just in circumstances not of their choosing. And I think the Corbyn movement that came together at that time was really a response to the dominant economic ideology of the day, call it Thatcherism or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, which had crashed in 2008 with the financial crash and had been unable to really reconstitute itself. And I think that transformed the terrain of politics. I describe it in the book as like an earthquake which rattles the buildings above, but it doesn't quite bring them down. We're still surrounded by all the same power structures, but they're teetering. They're more vulnerable than they used to be. And we're living in quite a precarious historical moment. I think when you're trying to understand what the Corbyn movement is, it probably helps to understand where it came from. So I'll just run through this briefly. I'll go into it in a lot more detail, obviously. But I think there were really 3 tributaries which flowed into the Corbyn movement in 2015. One ran through the party, one through the trade unions, and one through the kind of broader left. They all took their own path, but they were all really a response to that economic crash. In the party, the members had turned quite sharply against New Labour, and I think that's important because there's this myth that's been perpetuated ever since that in 2015 the Labour Party was done over by outsiders, that all these new people came flooding in and kind of stole the party from the existing members. The data, the evidence doesn't really support that. When the Corbyn campaign started phone canvassing members of the Labour Party, they thought they were freakishly phoning up every single Corbyn supporter in the party because they were getting such a great response. Corbyn moved into the lead in nominations by constituency parties, decided by people who go to meetings, who tend to be long-term members. 1 month into the race, he moved ahead. And this was before the first YouGov opinion poll came out showing Corbyn was in the lead. This was a time when 95% of the population had never heard of Jeremy Corbyn and there was no real hype about him, but he was already basically in the lead, although under the radar at the time, within the Labour Party membership itself. The second tributary went through the unions, and that's a longer process. I think that's more of a 15-year shift to the left. And I think that really comes from the way that Margaret Thatcher kicked the unions out of their previous economic role in the economy. After the Second World War, the unions had a seat at the table of the running of British industry. They were kind of part of capitalism, if you like, integrated into it. And then Thatcher came along and booted them out of that. And that had political repercussions that took a while to be felt, but basically the lack of their economic role meant that they were freer to act in different ways politically. And eventually that meant they came to a position where in 2015 the big unions like Unite and Unison and the CWU were willing to nominate somebody like Jeremy Corbyn for leader, which was a big departure for them because unions are generally very cautious organisations, especially in the realm of Labour politics. The third tributary from the broad left, that's really the movement activists, the non-Labour Party members, the kind of various causes of the left, and especially from 2010 to 2015, the anti-austerity movement, which was really the dynamic element in that movement. And the important thing really there was that the Corbyn campaign reached out to these people. It tried this new system of you can vote for £3 had been brought in, an idea which was completely a Blairite idea. It was their project, but it was actually Jeremy Corbyn's campaign that said, well, we can use this, we can appeal to all these people who go on demos and so on, and we can get them to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And actually, Liz Kendall tried it a little bit in 2015, but not very much. The other candidates really just ignored this scheme. And I think that kind of foreshadows what happened in 2017, where Labour was again trying to reach non-voters. The fact that we can trace those tributaries to the Corbyn movement, the fact that the Corbyn phenomenon didn't come from nowhere, I think is important. It means it wasn't a fluke what happened in the Labour Party, and it means there's more potential, hopefully, from it. When the economic orthodoxy can no longer deliver, I think political turbulence follows. That doesn't mean the left or Labour is necessarily going to win, but it means that there's an opportunity there to be seized. We've seen over the last 2 years since Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader that it wasn't enough just to get him in that position. His position had to be constantly defended, and it won't be enough either to get him Prime Minister. If Jeremy Corbyn is elected Prime Minister, there will be huge resistance, and it will require even bigger mobilisations both within the party and outside the party if that Labour government is going to be a success. But still, when historical opportunities come along, there's not much choice really. You don't get a choice of whether to bother or not. You have to seize them when you can. So that's my contribution. There's lots more in the book. If you want to buy one, they're on sale, I think, at the counter around the corner. There's a whole chapter in the book attacking the media, which I realised after I wrote it was not a very good idea when you're trying to get reviews. So if you want to buy the book and you read it and you like it, then please spread the word. I'm relying on word of mouth dissemination. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was really interesting and a really good insight into quite a few of the things that are in this book, and also, I guess, like the Labour Party in general, and how we've got to where we are today. So now we'll move on to some questions and answers. Has anybody got any questions? Yes.
At a counterfire event on Saturday morning that we both attended, you more impressively than me, John Rees said that. Oh, I can speak more loudly. Rather than.
See, it might work now.
Give it a go.
How's that?
Good so far.
At a counterfire event on Saturday morning, John Rees said that a close advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, I wonder if you might know who that was and tell us at the end of this, had said that he would not think of sending Jeremy to, I think it was a demonstration that he chose as an example, because it would not be prime ministerial. And Rees made the point, and I think it's an interesting point, that one of the reasons that Corbyn has been so successful and popular is that he's different. Now, there's a lovely bit in your book about how earlier on in the leadership campaign, someone was trying to get hold of him to buy him a new suit and make him look smart, and he kind of rushed off to avoid it at all costs. But he is now wearing pretty smart suits, and I wonder if he is worried about looking prime ministerial. There's clearly a tension, isn't there, between the old Jeremy and possibly new, and we hope, prime ministerial.
Do you want me to answer one at a time or a few at a time? Or?
Go for a few at a time.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
You sort of ended with a mention of the media. Now we've seen actually in the last day some really violent attacks by the media. totally ill-founded, but isn't this becoming a real danger to Jeremy's leadership and the possibilities for the future? Because although we may like to feel that, the media does not have so much influence as it used to, but it may still be quite important in influencing those that are perhaps somewhat undecided.
Yeah, shall I answer those two? Shall I risk trying with the mic? I'll try it. So the first question was about this comment, which was at a conference, we heard it, but at a conference on Saturday, John Rees said that one of Jeremy Corbyn's advisors had told him not to go to things where he might not look prime ministerial, such as the NHS march in Parliament Square earlier this year. I do think that that's a mistake. I think that Jeremy Corbyn's been at his best when he's been least prime ministerial. So if you take the videos he did, for example, when the Czech spy story happened, this is partly to do with the second question as well, when the Czech spy story happened and Corbyn did that video where he appealed directly to supporters through social media, that was really when he shone. And the same with when the bank JP Morgan attacked him, and they said Labour would be a threat to the banks, and he said yes, we would be. So that's really, I think, where he does well, and I agree that he shouldn't shy away from going on demonstrations. I don't want to go into too much about what John Rees said, but he also said that he shouldn't be appearing on Gogglebox, and I actually disagree with that, because I think that part of what the election revealed was that Jeremy Corbyn has an immense reach into popular culture, which nobody actually expected and wasn't contrived at all. But we saw it during the election that there were all these different communities, like the Grime for Corbyn movement. He was featured in Kerrang magazine and in The NME and so on and so forth. He was able to kind of transcend politics a bit, and I think that's something really valuable which shouldn't be taken for granted. In terms of the suits, I actually, in the update of the book, there was, just to explain this, in the original version of the book, this is the second edition, in the first version from before the general election, I quoted Cat Smith, the Labour MP, who said that in the early days of the Labour leadership election, she wanted to dress Jeremy Corbyn in a smart suit and make him shave, so that he'd look like Andy Burnham. And she told a story about how one of the campaign team had arranged to go and to get Corbyn and go to House of Fraser on Victoria Street and buy him a suit. And he just didn't turn up for an hour. And then when he did turn up in Parliament, somebody said, this guy's looking for you to take you to the House of Fraser, and he just ran away. So he kind of retained his kind of quirky version of the anti-austerity look and not wearing a suit, just wearing a shirt and not a tie. But then he has dressed smarter, and actually I asked Carrie Murphy, his chief of staff, how this had happened, and I quote her in the book. I'll read it out. He even looks, this was about the TV debates he did in the general election. He even looks smarter, dressed in what David Cameron might call a proper suit. This was Carrie Murphy's doing, and this, I quote Carrie, "Part of me has got my dad in my head saying, but he's got to look the part, Carrie." Contrary to press speculation that Operation Suit was Seamus Milne's doing, Carrie Murphy says, "Seamus has never raised it with Jeremy in his life. It's all me. I say, Jeremy, that suit's fucking horrible. It has to go. I phone his wife and I say, lose that suit. I bought suits, I bought shirts. Laura Parker, his political secretary, has been great and a great influence too. We empower each other. It drives him mad." So that's how they've managed to get Jeremy Corbyn to dress smarter, just by force. But yeah, I think you can do both. I think you can look the part and also retain that anti-establishment posture. And I think that's what you should do. On the second question about media attacks, are they a threat to Jeremy Corbyn in the future? Well, they have a dual effect. They're a double-edged sword, I think, the media attacks that have come in, because it was very interesting during the election that they chucked absolutely everything they could at Jeremy Corbyn, and it didn't seem to work. I don't think it probably did work with the demographic that reads the Daily Mail. If you look at the older voters, the Tories dominated. Younger voters, the Tories were nowhere, because younger voters were not necessarily taking so much notice. But in terms of the movement, I think it actually galvanises people when there's that sense of fighting against adversity, and it riles people up. And again, I think those are the kind of the the moments of greatest tension and stress are the ones where it seems to work the best for the Corbyn leadership. And in between, when everything seems to be going kind of swimmingly, I feel that the movement goes into a lull, if you like. And I think it is possible to, off the back of these media attacks, to actually have a political conversation with the public. I don't think you should be scared about just trying to talk to the public about politics. For example, over this Czech spy story, when, you know, this pan-media attack claiming that Jeremy Corbyn was a spy based on one guy who also claimed he organised Live Aid or the Mandela concert, it wasn't clear. He came out and said that. The media joined in. It was clearly ridiculous. And I think that people understand that that's ridiculous, and they understood that Jeremy Corbyn was under attack, and it didn't, I mean, the polling showed it didn't actually make any difference. Some people, about 6% were put off by Corbyn, but 6% were more supportive as a result of it. So that, in that case, didn't have any effect. I think with the current stuff, the Russian nerve gas attack, or alleged Russian nerve gas attack, I think that's much more serious. The polling is not as good on that. There was a poll today which showed that people do not think Jeremy Corbyn's right on that. And so that area of division, it's the sharpest area of division really within the Labour Party on foreign policy. And it always has been, and it probably always will be while he's leader. And I think that is something which has to be seriously, there has to be a strategy to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, there's one question there.
Do you not think that Jeremy Corbyn is a great internationalist? Because this has been underplayed and no mention has been made of this so far. I was outside the House of Commons the very day that the vote took place, and I was standing with the Yarlswood detainees, and first of all Donald strolled out fully suited and booted, and then about a quarter of an hour later Jeremy Corbyn strolled out with just a collar and tie, and he made a very good speech in Geneva fairly recently, and this was hardly reported in the media. And of course the record speaks for itself. I mean, for years he's been supporting the Palestinian campaign. He's also, which is not so well known, he's been involved in campaigns to do with the former African colonies. And, you know, I'm a little bit concerned that it's his internationalism that's one of his greatest assets, because he projected that at Geneva extremely well. If anybody's got a copy of his speech, it's well worth looking at. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So yeah, to what extent could Jeremy Corbyn's foreign policy actually be an advantage, and to what extent has it been an advantage in his career to date?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Jeremy Corbyn used to be called the Foreign Secretary of the Left before he was leader, because of his interest in international affairs and his defence of the Palestinians, the Kurds. He's an expert on. I mean, it's quite funny when you hear. There was a press conference or a speech he made in the general election, not the Geneva one. There was a speech he made about foreign affairs in the general election, when afterwards the press asked him lots of hostile countries, and every time they did, he kind of went into this huge lecture about the internal politics of whichever country it was they'd asked him about, and showed that he has, immense knowledge about these things. The trouble is, the reason why it's a flashpoint is because most of his parliamentary party have a completely different conception of politics, and this is really deep rooted in the Labour Party, where the right of the Labour Party has an Atlanticist view, pro-American view. I mean, it used to be pro-empire when Britain ruled, half the world, pro-NATO, pro-nuclear. And these have become shibboleths for the right of the Labour Party, pro-Israel as well. The kind of identity of the right of the Labour Party is not so much forged on domestic policy. Lots of not the Blairites, who are a slightly different species, but lots of the traditional right of the Labour Party, the Tom Watson part of the party, don't really disagree with Corbyn's domestic economic policies at all, because they're social democrats. But they do really sharply and quite violently disagree with his foreign policy, and he's in a minority, especially in the parliamentary party, as we've just seen this week, where he's been standing up and saying something, and then he's been getting more attacks from behind him than he has from the Tories across the House. So that's the reason why it's such a flashpoint. It's not that he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's that it's just a fault line in the Labour Party, basically. But the one thing we saw in the general election was, after the Manchester attack, this was one of the key moments when the Manchester attack happened. The Tories wanted to suspend campaigning for a kind of 7 days, long time, which was obviously to the disadvantage of the Labour Party. And they decided, it was actually Seamus Milne who decided, that Corbyn would do a speech on terrorism and security on the Friday after the attack, 4 days after the attack. And this was like a really big call. And people were phoning up his staff saying, if he does this, we're finished. Labour's, the election's over. They couldn't find a Labour MP to introduce him for that speech. Nobody was willing to put themselves, to associate themselves with this speech. When it was pre-briefed the night before, the press predictably ran with headlines saying Corbyn says Britain's to blame for terror, etc. And the journalists, you could see that the media commentators thought that this was the big slip-up, this was the big chance where they were going to get Corbyn. And then he gave the speech, and it was much more reasonable than people had predicted. He just said, effectively, he said jihadis are responsible for their own actions, but if you go into a region of the world and wreck it, and create the ideal conditions for jihadism to grow, you're not doing yourself any favours. That was basically the argument of his speech, which was the same argument as many people from the security services have made. And this was still dismissed as beyond the pale. You had all the Tories coming out saying he's making excuses for terrorism, it's appalling, it's disgraceful, all the press piling in. And then there was a YouGov poll, an instant YouGov poll, which showed that an absolute majority of the public agreed with Corbyn's speech, 54% against 20-something which disagreed. A massive result in favour of what Corbyn has said. And that really kind of shifted perceptions and turned things on its head. And so I think that in certain circumstances, especially when it comes to foreign intervention, it is actually an advantage, but he has to communicate that to the public over this incredibly hostile party and media on these topics.
Right, any other, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, to continue on that trend, it was very refreshing to hear a leader of the Labour Party, when that Saudi prince was visiting London, to hear Jeremy Corbyn using what I believe is privileged information that you have if you're a leader of Her Majesty's opposition. You have access to stuff, and the big difference is that while before any leader of the opposition would become complicit, Jeremy Corbyn took the opportunity to spill the beans, yeah, and in doing so, I think is doing something that politicians should do, which is to educate and change the mentality, not just to leave it to the press and give up. And I think that was, as the gentleman here, the comrade here says, an asset, to not just the foreign policy campaign, but the campaign to win minds and hearts, as the Americans used to say.
Great, thanks very much. Yes?
Shall I just speak?
Shout, I think.
I want to say I've already read the book, the updated edition, and it's terrific. It's very important that you wrote it, and I'm going to keep it for reference. So thanks very much for doing that. But one of the things that occurred to me, of course you updated it and it included the coup, and everybody knew that there was a coup planned and that there were various times when they thought they might spring it, but it was actually sprung the weekend after that amazing Brexit result that just stunned everybody. And it came to me a long while later, but I've never seen anybody else speculate on this. I can't forget it though, now I've thought it, which was that not only did it was it for the purpose of getting rid of Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, but it also served as an enormous distraction to help the government and the Conservative Party, which was in utter turmoil over an unexpected result. And I just wondered what thoughts you have on that.
Okay, shall I use that one or shall I? Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that's conspiracy, but it was certainly strategically stupid to wait until the Tories are in complete crisis and then push yourself into a complete crisis. And that coup, I think you're right, I think that coup was planned. There were several occasions when it was going to happen. There was a by-election in Oldham in December, I think, 2015, when the leadership expected there to be a coup after that, because the media was saying Labour's going to lose it to UKIP. Labour increased its vote share by 7% in that by-election, so they couldn't do a coup then. After the local election results in 2016, which weren't anywhere near as bad as people had been predicting, they weren't great, but they weren't terrible either, Neil Coyle, the MP from Bermondsey, went on Newsnight, and before any result had been announced, and said this isn't good enough, we've got to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. But then the results didn't turn out like he thought, and so that didn't work either. And then the referendum result happened, and I think they just thought it was just such a period of political flux and panic that they would just go for it, and they just couldn't help themselves. But they weren't very well organised. If it had been a real conspiracy, they would have been better at it, because they had two things going on at once. For a start, they had all the timed resignations on the hour, every hour on the media, and then they had a vote of no confidence, which had no constitutional standing. These things were kind of parallel but not quite in sync, and they hadn't seemed to just consider the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn might just say, I'm not going to resign, and then what would they do next? Because one of the misconceptions about the coup is that the leadership election that followed with Owen Smith was part of it. I don't think it was. I think it was actually legitimate. If Labour Party MPs had enough nominations to nominate a challenger to Jeremy Corbyn, and they thought that was the right thing to do, I don't think there's any problem with that. If they're then going to go to the membership and say, this is what we think, do you back us in an election? That's fine. But the coup was an attempt to stop Jeremy Corbyn from going back to the membership. It was an attempt to exclude him from the ballot at every stage, just, initially by making him resign, and then by trying to make him get the nominations again, accept more nominations in order to stand. So that coup was separate from the leadership election, and it just didn't. If Jeremy Corbyn was not going to do it, it wasn't going to work. And so I think that they, I think that to think it's a kind of thought through conspiracy probably overestimates their strategic vision. I think that's just my opinion, but you might be right.
Yeah, I think one of the things actually that you mentioned in the book is the spike in membership that happened directly after the coup, and sort of the things that happened after that. So yeah, it certainly didn't have the effect on the party that perhaps MPs thought it would at the time. Yes?
Yeah, I don't need the microphone. It's to do with means and ends, really, because one always thinks, I'm a great supporter of Jeremy, but one almost thinks that he's very pure in his beliefs and values and things, and you often wonder what would happen if he's got a serious problem, and it's a bad means to a good end, and then we've got the art of the possible concept, and now with this Russian thing, the real politics coming into it, but no one mentions that. I just wonder how much he would bend in order to keep power, which I think is a good thing within limits. But how much do you think he'd bend?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the attractions of Jeremy Corbyn is the idea that he wouldn't bend. I think he would bend less than most other politicians you can think of, because, he's so stubborn. He really won't do anything. One of his advisors said to me that some people in the media and so on say, what happens if Jeremy Corbyn's in a negotiation with Vladimir Putin? And this advisor said, I can't get him to do anything. If Jeremy Corbyn goes into a room with Vladimir Putin, Putin's getting nothing. And so apparently to make him do something, you have to pretend it's his idea and all that kind of stuff. So I think he's incredibly stubborn, but he's not completely inflexible. And I think we've seen that, for example, one example is internal party reform. There's a view, which is quite a strong view, which probably John Landsman holds. I think that was what was behind his General Secretary bid, that you should have, real pure party democracy, and that we should just do that immediately. And I think what we've seen is that Jeremy Corbyn's vision, Jeremy Corbyn believes in the same ends, but his way to get there is very much more managed. At conference last year, it was a very kind of managed solution that they came up with. Rather than having motions passed on the conference floor in a confrontation, the NEC did a deal before conference and just got conference to rubber stamp the deal that the NEC had done. So it seems that he does have kind of party management skills, and he does want to do things in a smooth way. So I think that does show a certain amount of flexibility. He's also, of course, not got his way on party policy on Trident, for example, and went into an election with the renewal of Trident in the manifesto, which a lot of people saw as a compromise. In actual fact, I asked about that, and I was told by his policy advisor that it's just Labour Party policy. They couldn't change it, because the unions are in favour of Trident because they represent the workforce, and so there was nothing. It wasn't like they had an argument and lost. There's just that was Labour Party policy, and they had to stick with it. And he proved himself able to do that. So I think he's probably more subtle than people think when people imagine that he's just, completely inflexible and an ideologue and all the things that are thrown at him. But at the same time, you'd rather have. I think even John McDonnell bends more than Jeremy Corbyn. John McDonnell's got a tendency to try and do cute, clever, strategic manoeuvres, which maybe don't always pan out, whereas Jeremy Corbyn's more kind of straight down the line.
Right. Any other questions? All right. There's one right at the back. I will pass the mic back for that.
Oh, they've got one down there.
Oh, is there one? Okay.
How come it's not intermittent anymore? It's really annoying.
Yes. You mentioned was it 5 million new voters for Labour? I was wondering how many of those, do you know how many of those would be soft, people who are voting for soft Brexit as opposed to a hard Tory Brexit? Any ideas from various research?
Well, this is one of the. This is.
No, it's when they're both on.
Right. Okay. This is one of the explanations which has been pushed by, especially by people like Robert Peston in the media, is the idea that it was an extraordinary surge for Labour and does require an explanation. And in order to not give Corbyn as much credit, the idea is, this is all Remainers flocking to the Labour Party in order to reverse Brexit or to stop Brexit. The data that I looked at doesn't really bear that out. There's a study by the British Election Survey, which is a very reputable electoral kind of analysis multi-university project, which is usually very authoritative, and they brought out a report saying it was the Brexit election. If you actually read that report, the headline's a bit over the top compared to the data they present. It clearly was the Brexit election for Conservative voters. Tory voters ranked Brexit number one priority, deciding their vote. And I think a lot of that was also because they absorbed UKIP. The UKIP basically just evaporated, and over 50% of their voters went to the Tories, and they were motivated by a desire to stop immigration and to leave the European Union. When you go to the Labour side, it's a different picture. Labour voters ranked it the fourth most important issue. And the new voters, those 5 million new voters, ranked it fourth, behind jobs and pay, education, and miles behind the NHS. So if what we were looking at was a surge towards Labour of people who wouldn't normally vote Labour but were just voting for the party to stop Brexit, you'd have expected Brexit to rank higher in their list of priorities. There's also a slight myth about young people and Brexit as well. If you look at the importance of Brexit to voters, it's markedly more important to older voters. There's mainly people who want to leave the European Union than it is to younger voters. It's just a line like that. Younger voters are not as bothered about Brexit, or in terms of their actual vote, they're not as bothered about Brexit. So I think that interpretation was certainly a part. There's certainly Brexit was a big issue. It was on the minds of Labour voters, no doubt about it. And I'm sure that part of the support was motivated by a desire to stop Theresa May's plans. But I don't think it deserves the kind of prominence it's been given by some commentators, as if that's the kind of the main causal factor for Labour surging in the polls. And I think that makes chronological sense in the way that the election started. Theresa May said it was all about Brexit. Remember, she started saying that the EU was trying to interfere in the election and all this kind of wacky stuff, which you'd normally accuse people of being conspiracy theorists if they said it, but she was the Prime Minister, so it was okay. And that was really the dominant theme for the first 2 weeks of the election. And she was on 49% in the polls, or 50% in one poll. And Labour was way down. And then after the manifestos launched, and Labour managed to successfully switch the conversation onto domestic policy, and they deliberately didn't really talk about Brexit, and they had their Article 50 position, which meant they could appeal to Leavers and Remainers. They really were alienating as few as possible on either side. when it switched to domestic policy, Labour surged in the polls and the Tories fell down with their dementia tax and all that kind of stuff. So just chronologically, it seems that Remain explanation doesn't really hold up. And when you dive into the data, I think it is an important factor, and it's very important for the Conservative vote, but I don't think it's as important for the Labour vote.
I'm going to jump in with a question as well. On Brexit and Corbyn, one of the there are these populist movements which are popping up all over the place, and the kind of, as you kind of alluded to in one of your answers earlier, it doesn't seem to be obvious why one country will plump for a left candidate and another a right. So you'll see that there are things like the Italian election results, where both quite a left-wing and a very right-wing party hoovered up quite a lot of votes. To what extent do you think the things that drove Brexit and are driving those sort of wider things are behind what's driven Corbyn to where he is now?
I do think there's a lot in that. I think that the Brexit vote is complicated, and I think you can't just pretend it wasn't largely about immigration for lots of people, because I think it was. But even with immigration, I think a lot of that is down to people resenting their economic circumstances and blaming a scapegoat. But yeah, I think that I think it goes back to what I said about the financial crash of 2008, disrupting the economic orthodoxy, or at least proving that the economic orthodoxy is not working for many people, and then it not being able to reconstitute itself. And you've got, we've had years of stagnant wages. If people aren't earning much and inflation's going up and they're getting poorer, eventually that's going to have a political consequence. And I think that we've seen that all around Europe, and how it manifests itself depends on the local political traditions. So in Greece, for example, we had the rise of Syriza at the expense of the established Labour Party equivalent, PASOK, and that's because Greece has got a very proud kind of Marxist tradition which goes back to the Civil War and the Second World War in Greece. And so they benefited from that. In other countries, you've seen the rise of, Donald Trump, you've seen the rise of right-wing populists, but even Donald Trump appealing to some of the same kind of economic frustrations of working class people and so on. So yeah, I think it can manifest itself differently. I think the key thing about the Labour Party in Britain is that when you're looking at how this works on the left, in most of continental Europe, this has resulted in the collapse, effectively, of the Social Democratic Party, the main Social Democratic Party. We've seen it all over the place. We've seen it just recently in Germany and Italy, seen it before that in Greece, seen it in Spain, seen it in the Netherlands. In France last year, the Socialist Party candidate got 6%, which is an incredibly low number for one of the two main parties, or was two main parties. Whereas in Britain, this kind of trend of the Social Democratic Party collapsing has not happened, and instead Labour has gone up from its 2015 result and from its 2010 result up to 40% of the vote. And I think that that's largely a consequence of first past the post-electoral system, which means that a challenger party to the left is not going to succeed, so it could be done through Labour. And this bizarre coincidence, which I talked about, of Labour changing its election rules and allowing people to come into the Labour Party, meant that in Britain, rather than it being a left-wing challenger party taking votes from the Social Democratic Party and then both collapsing or both not getting into government, in Britain the left has done it through the established Social Democratic Party, and that seems to so far be a far preferable solution. Not that it's possible in many of those other countries, but in Britain that's been a far preferable solution.
Thanks very much. There's two. I'll go to the man right at the very back.
What do you see as the future of these Labour MPs who are at the other end of the spectrum from Corbyn?
Okay, so I'll just repeat that for the cameras. What do you see as the future for the Labour MPs who are really on the opposite side of the Labour Party from Corbyn?
Bleak. I've actually been quite surprised at how badly they've done in terms of not outlining any kind of strategy to try and get themselves back into some position of influence. I mean, at the moment, they've just done this early day motion saying, beyond the government, they're absolutely certain that Russia did this nerve gas attack, which I think Russia probably did do it, but they're absolutely certain, even more certain than the government that's got the intelligence. And if you look at the names on that early day motion, they're the same names as have been rebelling on every single foreign policy issue, but also many domestic issues as well. They're a kind of 20 to 30 completely irreconcilable Labour MPs who are, call them Blairites, that's basically what they are, most of them, who just have different politics. I mean, that's fair enough. Jeremy Corbyn had different politics from the leadership for a long time, and he rebelled a lot as well. They just have a different political conception, and they're not where the membership of the party is. The trouble is, they don't seem to have any real strategy beyond being a right pain in the arse. That's how they come across. If they came across as constructive critics who are putting ideas forwards and who are coming up, really using the time on the backbenches to come up with a new vision of how they see their version of centre-left politics working in the current circumstances, rather than just harking back to the formulas of the 1990s, then they'll be doing something, I think, far more beneficial to themselves than what they are doing, which is just appearing to be obstructionists or wreckers or whatever you want to call it. So I think really it's in their own hands to an extent. I wouldn't rule out that they would make a comeback, because I think the right of the Labour Party still has significant power. Even within the party, it still has significant power. It still controls regional bureaucracies and so on, for example. Still controls most of local government. Still has overwhelming support in the PLP, and they still have strong links in society. For example, with the media, they've got massive access to the media. So they're not finished by any means. But I do think that they should try and come up with a project of their own that's a bit more positive than the one they have done so far.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So yeah, the gentleman over there. Yep.
Yes, May did the worst campaign seen in the whole of Europe for 100 years. Shouldn't Jeremy have won?
I think when you consider where he came from, that was unrealistic. After the 2015 general election, after Ed Miliband lost, the Fabian Society produced a report called, I think it was called A Mountain to Climb, in which they analysed the marginal seats. Basically, there weren't very many marginal seats after the 2015 election, because Labour lost quite a lot by a big margin. So it would have taken a ginormous swing to win that election, whenever it came, whoever was the leader after the 2015 results. So I think it's rather unfair to say that there was really that much possibility to win. If you look at where
those swings in Europe, with these new parties, like they're coming from nowhere, getting 37%.
Yeah, sure, okay, I accept that, but I think in the British first past the post system, it's probably maybe not as likely to happen in that way, because it's not a proportional system where people can just vote for that wherever they are. That's why smaller parties don't ever come through. But also, what we saw in the general election was Labour got a vote which would normally assure it of a majority in terms of the number of votes and the percentage. But the Tories got an even more extraordinary result, even despite their campaign, because they hoovered up UKIP votes. And I think that's where, and that's still the story of the opinion polls now. That's why Labour's not further ahead in the opinion polls. It's not that Labour's doing badly. The last survey had Labour at 44, I think, something like that. Which is historically really good for Labour, and also something which every commentator said was completely impossible until the general election. But the Tories are still, their vote is solid and constant, and I think that a large part of that is that the Brexit effect, the fact that if you're somebody whose main concerns are stopping immigration and leaving the European Union, UKIP doesn't exist, so who are you going to vote for but the Tories? They've got that kind of vote built in, and I think that's the key element of the opinion polls at the moment, and why Labour didn't win the 2017 general election.
Okay, are there any more questions, or people are looking a bit thirsty? Okay, so well, I'd say thanks very much for an amazing speech, and also for taking all of our questions, Alex.